How's everybody doing? For today's lecture, we are going to be discussing the Arab Spring and the outcomes of the revolutions that broke out across the Middle East. If you haven't seen my prior lectures on Middle East politics or the Arab Spring more specifically, make sure to go and watch that. You'll understand this lecture a lot better. Now, the point of this lecture, we're going to try to understand why it is that Tunisia was the only country to have a democratic transition in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Now, when these revolutions broke out, there was great hope that this would lead to a new wave of democratization across the world and within the Middle East specifically. Some scholars have called this the fourth wave of democratization. But unfortunately, this is not what took place across the region. First off, in most of these countries, autocracy survived. So, for example, Bahrain had a revolution, but its monarchy survived with the help of Saudi Arabia. Now, in other cases, regimes were overthrown, but there were failed transitions to democracy very soon after. So, for example, Egypt, its dictator got overthrown in 2011, Hosni Mubarak, and just 2 years later, the military stepped back into power. We get a return to authoritarianism. Now, in a bunch of other cases, we end up with really horrifying civil wars and no democratic transitions. So in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, we end up with a lot of political violence, right? So in these cases, no democratic transitions at all. Our only case study where there was a democratic transition, in other words, there were competitive elections that were held in consecutive election cycles, was Tunisia. From 2011 to 2021, in this 10-year period, Tunisia developed into a democracy. And so, what we're going to try to understand is why this takes place. And furthermore, more generally, why do countries sometimes transition into democracies? Now, this map just helps us to kind of understand this, right? So from the end of 2010 throughout 2011, a wave of revolutions spread across the Middle East, starting with Tunisia and then moving on to other countries. Now, as you can see here on this map, countries in blue that transition to democracies, Tunisia was the only case. Libya, Syria, and Yemen are going to have civil wars. And we'll talk about Syria in a couple of classes. Now, as for the other cases, you could see either their protests were relatively minor or they had major protests, but they did not lead to democracy. So what makes Tunisia a special case? Well, in order to understand this, we do have to understand more general factors that lead to democracy. Now, in order to understand these theoretical explanations, we have to understand what structural explanations are. Any structural explanation, it is a cause of something in politics that is outside the control of individual human beings. It's something that people are born into and that shape their lives and their decision making. And in terms of democratization, there are several critical structural factors that make democracy more likely. Okay, so what are these factors? What are these long-term causes? Well, according to Seymour Lipset, one of the big causes of democratization is modernization, meaning as a country becomes more modernized economically, socially, and politically, it is more likely to become a democracy. So, for example, if a country is more economically developed, if it's more urbanized, wealthy, and industrialized, it is more likely to become a democracy. And there are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, as countries move from being very rural to being very urbanized, right? As people start to move to cities, as they start to move into the industrial and service sector, as they start to grow more and more wealthy, what happens is a middle class develops. And with a larger middle class, they are more powerful, the average citizen. They have more resources per person. They're more able to protest. They are more aware of what's happening in the political system. They have a greater ability to influence the political system. And when this happens, that middle class can mobilize their resources against a dictatorship. They can engage in mass protests and they can influence politics. And then this makes it more likely for political elites to give power to the masses, right? So in simple terms, the wealthier your country is, the more likely it is you are to be a democracy. right? So the larger the middle class, the more likely you can in turn have a revolution. Whereas in contrast, when you have a poor peasantry, for farmers living in the countryside, they have less resources to mobilize against the state. Okay, so we call this economic modernization. So this was a key aspect of Seymour Lipset's theory on modernization, right? So the more developed you are, the more likely it is you could become a democracy. Now, there's other aspects of modernization that are critical here. So, other than the economic component, there's also the cultural component. As countries develop economically, they are also more likely to develop culturally. They're going to develop mass education systems. And with the emergence of mass education, you're going to develop a more literate population. So, obviously, countries that are wealthier can also start to invest more in their school systems. They are also, as well, more likely to have more advanced communications technology and mass media that's going to lead to a more politically conscious population. And the more literate a population is, not only are they going to be more aware of what's happening in the political system, but you're going to start to see greater supports for modern ideologies like democracy. Whereas in a poor agricultural based society, you're more likely to see more religiously superstitious people. You're more likely to see people with traditional cultural values. In a more modern, economically developed society, you're also likely to see more modern values, such as support for democracy, women's rights, support for more modern types of political systems like democracy. And so, as a consequence, within these societies, you're more likely to see greater support for democracy. In fact, we've seen this in the Middle East. In our prior lecture, I showed how over time, more and more citizens are beginning to support democracy in the region. And in turn, when you do have a revolution, more of those revolutionaries are more likely to support democracy, right? So that is another factor that explains democratization that is structural in nature. Now, finally, last but not least, political modernization. As countries develop, they're also more likely to have stronger states that can create more political stability in society, as well as create a stronger sense of national identity. So, if you have a stronger state that can enforce the rule of law, that can, lead the way towards economic development by investing in schools and industry, you are more likely to have stability as well as communal trust between citizens. Okay, a stronger nation state is going to lead to more stability in society. You can't have a democracy if you have chaos and a failed state overall, right? So if there is too much state failure, you're going to end up with civil war, like Somalia, for example. So the stronger the nation states, the more social stability. Now, on top of that, stronger states can promote strong national identities, right? Through the school system, they could create a common sense of identity across millions of people. This will make civil wars less likely. And in turn, when you have less cultural divisions, this means that amongst the protesters that lead a revolution, they are less likely to have divides amongst themselves. Okay. And this in turn will make it harder for the state to promote cultural divisions in society, right? Amongst those protesters. And so, thus, the revolutionaries have a greater chance of success if they are spending more time united with each other and less time fighting with each other, right? So this is something that is a critical aspect of democratization. So what makes these structural explanations as well is that they're long-term explanations. They're something you're kind of born into, right? It takes decades or even centuries to engage in economic, cultural, and political modernization. But if those components are there, you're more likely to have a democratic transition. And let me just show you the data on this, just to be more clear about this. This is looking at economic and political data collected on countries throughout the globe and comparing them. Okay. So we can see here that in this chart from this particular year, countries that are more democratic, meaning the higher up they are on the scale, the more democratic they are, the more likely they are to be economically wealthy. So we can see here the log of GDP per capita, the average, basically measuring the average productivity per person, a rough measure for as well their average salary. As countries grow wealthier, they are more likely to be democracies. So look at the top right-hand corner of the scale here. We have Norway, Italy, Chile, the United States, South Korea. Relatively wealthy countries are more likely to be democratic. In contrast, poor countries like Tanzania, Burundi, Togo are more likely to be dictatorships. So there's a common trend within the data here. Now, a couple of quick things. There are some exceptions to the rule, outliers. We have our Arab Gulf countries, Kuwait, Qatar. These countries, while they're wealthy, their wealth primarily comes from having small populations with a lot of oil wealth. This makes you more likely to be a dictatorship, right? Because without economic diversification, the wealth is not spread out across society. This explains why we have some stable dictatorships in the Arab Gulf. So, in short, the more industrialized and wealthy you are, the more likely you are to be a democracy. Now, what advantages did Tunisia have over the long term that can explain their democratic success? Well, number one, Tunisia urbanized greatly from independence up until its revolution in 2011. In 1960, only about a third of the population lived in cities. By the time we get to the Arab Spring, the number was about two-thirds. So the urban population doubled, particularly within the city Tunis in the northeast. And as the urban areas grew, this means you have a larger middle class. It means you have improvements in education, right, and improvements in standard of living and healthcare. More citizens started getting involved in protests, right, as well as getting involved in politics. And in turn, we get the cultural modernization. As Tunisia modernized economically, it also modernized culturally. We begin to see literacy rates grow. Only about a third of the population, so less than a third of the population was literate, okay, all the way up until the 1970s. But as the economy grew, more and more kids started to grow into school. So this economic modernization led to cultural modernization. And by the eve of the revolution, about two-thirds of people in Tunisia were literate with a high standard of education. Now, we can also compare Tunisia with other Arab countries. So first, unlike the Arab Gulf states, Tunisia has very little in the way of oil. Its economic development that it did engage in had to depend a lot on building new factories, being able to mass produce textiles, for example, and other products, and then export them to Europe. So Tunisia, its economic development was more dependent on industry. Now, number two, Tunisia is more economically developed than a lot of the Arab republics. Take Yemen, for example. Tunisia is 4 times wealthier than Yemen. Yemen had a revolution as well, but as being a very poor country, we did not see a democratic transition there. In contrast, we did see one in Tunisia. So Tunisia is what is called a middle income country, by the way. So it has a GDP per capita that's well above $1,000 per person. So Tunisia fits some of these long-term explanations for democratization. Prior to the revolution, its middle class grew, its rates of literacy grew, its support for democracy grew over time. Now, there are also short-term explanations for revolution that are based on the choices made by individuals that lead these revolutions and their relationship with actors within the state and the choices they make, the dictator and their inner circle. So these are called rational choice explanations or short-term causes for democratization. So individuals also have some agency, some choice, and the choices they make can impact whether or not a country becomes a democracy. Now, what we tend to see with revolutions is the more peaceful they are, and the more negotiations you have between the revolutionaries and the authoritarian elites, the more likely it is you will have a democratic transition. So, of course, there is some choice involved here because dictators, as well as revolutionaries, can either decide to negotiate or engage in violence. Now, why is this the case? Well, if you have a more violent transitional process, that's not very good for a democratic transition. With violence comes civil war, failed states, and instability, like what happened in Libya Syria, and Yemen. But if you have a more peaceful process like what happened in Tunisia as well as Egypt, you are more likely, there is more likely to be a chance of a democratic transition. So when these peaceful transitions happen, they often happen because of what is called pact making. This is when moderates within the opposition, the revolutionaries, decide to engage in peaceful negotiations with some members of the regime, moderate members of the state, to agree on a democratic transition. So the pact making process during the third wave of democratization, places like Latin America, this was the most common way countries became democracies. Believe it or not, it's usually not via cutting off the heads of the revolutionary elites or throwing them in prison and establishing a new democracy. When you get violence, it tends to lead to conflict and civil war, like what happened in revolutionary France in 1789. Believe it or not, France never transitioned to a democracy after its revolution in 1789. In fact, it would take 4 revolutions before France would become democratic. Now, in order to have pact making, though, in order for this to happen, there are some structural factors involved. There has to be some balance of power between the state actors and the opposition, right? If the opposition is too weak, like it was in Yemen, for example, the revolutionaries were way too weak in Yemen, the state actors are going to end up dominating the process, and you're not going to get a transition to democracy, right? They might make some moderate reforms, the state actors, the government, but at the end of the day, you're not going to see a democratic transition because the opposition is too weak. Now, if the opposition perceives itself to be too strong, sometimes what could happen is mass violence as they decide to engage in violence with the dictatorship and overthrow them with bloodshed. This could often lead to a failed democratic transition. So oftentimes you need a good balance of power between these actors. Now, on top of that, to have a strong opposition that could negotiate with the state has to be able to respect the opposition. The opposition has to be united, right? The more homogenous and united the opposition is, the harder it will be for the state to play divide and conquer, right? If you have a strong opposition amongst the revolutionaries that are not divided ethnically, religiously, politically, they are more likely to work together to pressure the state to have a democratic transition. Now, in Syria, as you're going to find out in a couple of lectures, the revolutionaries were very diverse and divided amongst themselves. And you're going to find out how that created a problem for that country's revolution. In contrast, in Tunisia, Tunisia's a more relatively homogenous country where the vast majority of people are Arab speaking Muslims, where you also have a lot of support for democracy amongst the revolutionaries. And so couple of other things as well. Part of what explains Tunisia's democratic success is the opposition was much stronger in Tunisia than in Egypt. Part of the reason for this is that Egypt's military had disproportionate power within the country. We're going to learn about this next class. In contrast, Tunisia's military was relatively weak and professional. We talked about this last class. And as a consequence, the authoritarian regime was relatively weaker politically in Tunisia than in Egypt. This made it easier for the revolutionaries to negotiate with the authoritarian regime in Tunisia. In fact, in Egypt, the spending, on the military is about 5% of GDP, whereas in Tunisia, it was less than 2% on the eve of the revolution. And on top of that, the Egyptian military had a long history of getting involved in politics via military coups, whereas in Tunisia, you didn't have this type of history of the military being politicized. So as a result, this made it easier for the opposition to negotiate with the state in Tunisia. Now, last but not least, Islamists were less powerful in Tunisia, particularly far-right Islamists that don't support democracy. In Tunisia, the liberals, in comparison with Egypt, are far larger in number. And number two, the Islamists that did have a lot of power, such as the party Ennahda, were Muslim Democrats that believed in the mixing of their Islamic values with liberal democratic principles. This made it much easier to have a democratic transition. In contrast, in Egypt, there are far more Salafists within the country, as you're going to find out next lecture. Now, last but not least, another factor that can make pact making easier is when the international community gets involved in a way where they're promoting democracy instead of promoting civil war or giving weapons to one side or another. If you have the international community acting as bad actors, they can sometimes make the situation worse by encouraging the opposition to engage in violence or perhaps encouraging the state to engage in a crackdown. Now, one of the benefits that Tunisia has is that A, it is not a strategically valuable country. It doesn't have a lot of oil. It doesn't sit atop an important canal. So as a result, there were less state actors trying to get involved to support one side or another. And on top of that, Tunisia has a lot of historical relations with France and with the EU. The European Union played a big role here in mediating this process to try to pressure both sides to engage in pact making and democratization. In contrast, the United States was a little more wary about the revolution in Egypt and the Arab Spring, as well as in other places like Bahrain, because of the strategic importance of those countries, right? So the United States has a military base in Bahrain. It also, the Suez Canal is found in Egypt. There are different international dynamics with those countries. So in Egypt, okay, the factors that could lead to positive pact making were not as much there like they were in Tunisia. In Tunisia, they were. And so when you have a relative balance of power and international actors that are encouraging pact making, this makes pact making more likely. And democratization becomes a way out of the stalemate when you have a relative balance of power between forces in a country. Okay. And so you could have negotiations and they'll agree then to create a new constitution and hold new elections. So that's how pact making works. So I'm going to go now into the case study of Tunisia just to elaborate how this works. Now, as we discussed last lecture, Tunisia's authoritarian regime, led by Ben Ali and the Democratic Constitutional Rally, that political party that had ruled Tunisia since 1987, it was overthrown. Right. And so Ben Ali is forced to flee the country. And these protests, unlike as what you're going to find out in the case of Egypt, were mainly led by left wingers. In fact, the biggest organization involved in these protests was the UGTT, the Tunisian General Labor Union. And liberal activists within the lawyers' syndicates and other organizations, they were heavily involved, as well as a lot of young liberal youth. Now, there were some Islamists involved, but at the time, Ennahda was in exile. Okay, they were in exile in Great Britain and France. Their leadership was abroad. Now, their leadership will come back to Tunisia, but after Ben Ali flees the country and after many Islamists are released from prison. Now, one of the key aspects of this revolution is that the military stayed neutral. Now, what happened is the protest grew so large that the police were overwhelmed. And the police, okay, they are going to go into hiding. So they are going to really have to bow down in the face of mass protests. Now, the military, with its tanks, its aircraft, could have potentially gotten involved and crushed a protest for Ben Ali. But here's the thing, the military had a long history of being professional, small, and not involved in domestic politics. And when Ben Ali went to the generals and asked them to help, the military basically said, no, that's not our role. We are not going to get involved in this. Now, there were certainly some fears as well that if they had gotten involved, there could have been some splintering in the military, a potential civil war. But the biggest reason is the generals had this really strong ethos of we don't get involved in politics and we're not going to fire our weapons on our Tunisian citizens. They felt their role was to protect Tunisian citizens, not attack them. So the military stayed neutral. Now, on top of that, Ennahda, because of its time spent in Europe and because they had a lot of well-educated activists, they were in favor of Muslim democracy. They wanted a democratic transition. And so thus, with the secularists, they start to form a coalition. They form this temporary council, and they agree to hold elections in October of that year. So they form a transitional government. They agree to hold elections, and they agree that the winners of those elections will be able to write the new constitution. And so elections are held in October of 2011, and they elect an assembly to write the constitutions itself. And by the way, this temporary government, they reversed the laws that were found under the Ben Ali regime that restricted freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Suddenly, thousands of new NGOs and political parties emerge. A much more vibrant civil society exists in Tunisia after this. And on top of that, at least initially, members of the former ruling party, the Democratic Constitutional Rally, the RCD, are going to be initially banned, although you're going to find out how this is going to create problems and how former members of the regime are going to make a political comeback here and are going to engage in negotiations with these pro-democracy activists. So just to compare the data here, by the way, Tunisia, lower spending on the military than Egypt. For most of Tunisia's post-independence history, the regime has spent relatively little on its military, often less than 1% of its GDP per capita. And its military has been involved more in focusing on defense of the country, not on domestic affairs. In contrast, Egypt has regularly spent over 5% of its budget before the revolution. So before the revolution, you could see here that they spent a lot on their military. And on top of that, the military is heavily involved in the economy and other domestic affairs within Egypt. In fact, all of the previous presidents in Egypt prior to the revolution were former members of the military prior to 2011. In contrast, none of the prior presidents in Tunisia were members of the military. So this enabled the beginnings of this democratic transition. Now, what happened as a result of these elections? Well, Annetta did win a plurality of the vote, meaning they won the most seats in parliament, but they didn't win a majority. Okay. And because they didn't win a majority, it's a parliamentary system, they needed to form a coalition. And they formed a coalition with two left-wing parties. This coalition was known as the Troika because there were three parties involved. The first party was the Congress for the Republic, formed by Monsef Marzouki. We talked about this person in the prior lecture. He was one of the founding members of the Tunisian League for the Defense of Human Rights. He was a left-winger. He was actually sent into exile by the Ben Ali regime, and he returned after the revolution. He was elected president. He won the presidential vote here. So there's a semi-presidential system established here. So he became the president of this country, and he forms a coalition with Annetta. Their party also won the second most amount of votes. And the other party was the Democratic Forum for Labor and Liberties, otherwise known as Etiketul for its acronym, and its leader was Mehdi Juma. You could see these three individuals here. On the left is Rashid Ghannouchi. So he was, by the way, the leader of Annetta. And second to the right is Mehdi Juma from the Democratic Forum for Labor and Liberties. And to the far right is Monsef Marzouki, okay, for the Congress for the Republic. So these three individuals got together. They engaged in the beginnings of pact making to try to lead the way towards this democratic transition. And since Annetta is a moderate Islamist party, they were more than willing to engage in these negotiations to create a new constitution because they wanted a democracy. Now, just to look at more data to see how Tunisia differs, part of the reason why pact making was possible here is that the Islamists are much more moderate in comparison with many other countries, lots of Muslim Democrats like in Turkey. And number two, there are far more liberals and far more secularists and even non-religious folk in Tunisia. So these are the percentages of people, according to Arab Barometer data, that say that religion is not important in their lives across the Middle East and North Africa, amongst Arab countries. And we can see here in Tunisia, whether right after the revolution or closer to the present, in Tunisia, there are far more secularists as well as non-religious folk in the country. In comparison, in Libya, Algeria, Lebanon, Morocco, Egypt, Sudan, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, and Yemen, there are far fewer secularists. Okay, and we can see here this is the case with Egypt. In Egypt, as you're going to find out next class, the Salafists have far more influence within the country's political culture. So now, with that said, this pact making process did not always go smoothly. Over the next 3 years, there were challenges, okay, big challenges. Number one, the revolutions in neighboring countries also led to civil wars and conflict, particularly in neighboring Libya, which led to a huge wave of migrants flooding over into the border into Tunisia as well as in Egypt. And on top of that, the revolution in Tunisia did not exactly inspire confidence in Tunisia's economy. A lot of foreigners stopped investing in Tunisia. There was a decline in foreign direct investment. Many tourists stopped coming to the country. And so thus, there was an economic decline in these Arab Spring countries, including in Tunisia. Right, this hurt the democratic transition processes elsewhere. It also created problems within Tunisia itself. And of course, when you have a wave of migration, this doesn't just create economic problems, it creates tensions between those who support the rights of migrants in countries like Tunisia and those who want to kick the migrants out. So you had a lot of migrants coming from neighboring Libya. You had a lot of migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa, from places like Cote d'Ivoire, from places like Cameroon. I actually interviewed a lot of these folks, a lot of these migrants during my research. And so I studied this migrant movement quite a bit. And so migration to sub-Saharan Africa increased greatly during this period. You see, in neighboring Libya, Libya in 2011, unlike Tunisia, had a civil war. Gaddafi's regime, which we talked about last class, he decided to engage in violence with the protesters. He cracked down severely. He didn't want to negotiate at all. Gaddafi was, as a personalistic dictator, was also a bit mentally unstable, and he actually used a lot of mercenaries from sub-Saharan Africa to try to attack the protesters. And the protesters, in turn, got a lot of help from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that bombed Gaddafi. So as a result of this, there was a civil war. And in fact, till this day, Libya is still divided by a number of different factions as a result of this. So a lot of those migrants spread across the border into Tunisia, creating all sorts of issues for the country. Now, on top of that, because of this, number one, there was a small number of Salafi jihadists that took advantage of the instability in the region to penetrate Tunisia, and a small number of individuals within Tunisia were also radicalized into Salafi jihadism. The numbers there are still small, but there was some radicalization. And so as a consequence, we do see these underground terrorist movements start to operate in Tunisia more. So some of these individuals did come out and engage in protests. Some engaged in terrorist attacks on Western tourist sites, such as beaches and hotels. There was also assassinations of liberals. There was, in fact, in 2013, two prominent liberals were assassinated by Salafi jihadists, so these far right-wing fundamentalist Islamists that support the mixing of religion and Islam and are not in favor of democratization. So just to give you an example of one of these movements, a Salafist group called Ansar Sharia, an affiliate of Al-Qaeda, emerged in Tunisia that had at its height in Tunisia about 10,000 members. And there were some debates about whether or not this group should be able to participate in Tunisia's elections, or because of the fact that they were an anti-system party, they were not in favor in the long term of democracy, if they should be banned or not. Initially, there were debates within Ennahda about, whether or not this group should be tolerated. Now, Ennahda itself was not a radical Salafist jihadist group, but there were debates about, should we tolerate the existence of this far-right movement? So this is kind of like the KKK in the United States, if you want a rough equivalent of this. And now on top of this, some radical jihadists were involved in an insurgency along the Algerian border in the mountain ranges there. So there was a security crisis within Tunisia during this era. And this made it thus more difficult for Islamists and liberals to negotiate over the new constitution. Many liberals became terrified, and thus it made it harder to negotiate with the Netta. And some Islamists, a minority of them, were starting to be radicalized, making it harder for them to negotiate with liberals. Okay, so this is where former regime elites saw an avenue to get involved in politics. The former Ben Ali regime was secular, and they started to convince some liberals that supported the revolution to come over to their side. And so thus the former regime elites, they start to mobilize their own political party called Nideh Tunis. Okay, it was a secular party. Okay, and many members of Nideh Tunis wanted to return to the old authoritarian regime. They wanted a counter-revolution. In fact, there was growing support for counter-revolution in Tunisia by 2013. And in that summer, in the wake of several assassinations of prominent liberals, this insurgency, mass migration, they engaged in mass protest across the country. Okay. And so, for example, some of these protesters were feminists. Many of whom that had protested in the revolution, but were scared of a constitution that would support Islamist values and Sharia law. And of course, they were in favor of the rights of women, these protests. So there was a lot of worries about this. Some of these protesters as well were from former members of the authoritarian regime. The leader of Nideh Tunis was Beji Said Essebsi. He was a former Ben Ali official that led this new party. And so thus, there was a lot of fears amongst supporters of democracy in Tunisia that the whole thing was going to collapse. So how did they overcome these problems? Well, the moderates who supported democracy on the left and right, the secularists and Islamists, they eventually came together and negotiate to avoid a return to authoritarianism and to avoid a civil war. Now, part of what helped them is that you had some powerful pro-democracy organizations, the Tunisian General Labor Union and three other major civil society organizations, the student union activists, the labor activists, the business associations, as well as the lawyer syndicates. They come together to pressure the secularists and Islamists to negotiate. And on top of that, the European Union and the UN provide incentives here. They provided the promise of aid to Tunisia if they transitioned to a democracy. And I think what helped it as well is you didn't have countries like Iran and Russia and the United States sending weapons to one side or another here. You didn't have NATO getting involved in bombings. This helped out a lot with Tunisia. I think it helped a lot the fact that this country has very little oil and very little strategic importance for a lot of other countries. So the EU provides aid. The EU here, they could be very idealistic about supporting democracy in Tunisia. And so thus they sit down, they negotiate, and they hammer out a new constitution. In 2014, Tunisia becomes a semi-presidential system of government. Okay. And so it had a democratically elected president as well as a parliament with a prime minister. And this constitution was a largely secular constitution, and Netta agreed to compromise. They agreed that this constitution would be secular. That means that it would not impose Sharia law on individuals within society. And so thus Netta showed itself to compromise. Rashid Ghannouchi showed himself to be pro-democracy here. And on top of that as well, Netta agreed to allow former members of the authoritarian regime to participate in elections. But Nideh Tunis, in turn, agreed to a democratic transition, right? So the former autocratic supporters agreed that we would now have a democracy. And thus, competitive elections, 2 in a row, were held. Nideh Tunis won those elections with a plurality in 2014, and they actually decided to allow Netta to join the ruling coalition. Several members of Netta were able to have ministers within the government. So this was a very big deal here. We get this big Islamist and liberal coalition as a sign of symbolic unity. And 5 years later, when Netta won a plurality, they did the same thing. They allowed the left to form a coalition with them. And so this would not have been possible without pact making, without individuals in civil society getting together to ensure that both sides or multiple sides that were negotiating compromised on various issues. And this is what made the democratic transition possible. So this here is the quartet, the four members that led this democratic transition. They also won the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, one last thing I want to talk about here. The democratic reforms went beyond just the creation of the new constitution. Various civil society organizations emerged to also make reforms to not only increase freedom of speech and civil liberties, but to improve the rights of minorities in Tunisia. In the aftermath of the revolution, a great number of new NGOs emerged to support groups that previously struggled to gain representation within society because the prior authoritarian regime did not recognize the existence of diversity. They promoted this idea that the country was an Arab Muslim nation. So after the revolution, we see the emergence of Black Tunisians, the descendants of slaves within Tunisia, promoting reforms that recognize the existence of this group and promoting anti-racist discourse. We also see the emergence of sub-Saharan migrant groups within the country promoting the rights of migrants, promoting asylum for migrants, and giving help to the desperately poor migrants that were trying to live and work in Tunisia, giving them access to the equivalent of a green card, right? The ability to work in the country. We also see as well the emergence of Amazigh rights organizations. The Amazigh, they're this minority, a little less than 1%, that speak a non-Arabic language in the country. We also see the emergence of groups for the first time representing the LGBTQ community. At the time, and this is still the case actually in Tunisia, being gay could get you up to 3 years in prison. And so they promoted reforms. We also have religious minorities, Jews and Christians and other groups promoting the rights of these different communities. And when these groups emerged, initially they didn't have a lot of resources, right? So they began to mobilize, they began to make alliances with some older civil society organizations in Tunisia, particularly women's rights groups which did exist prior to the revolution, as well as human rights groups like the Tunisian, Association for Human Rights. So they formed these organizations, and they also got a lot of help and resources from transnational organizations, TNGOs, such as Minority Rights Group International, as well as from international organizations like the UN and the EU. And so they end up getting a lot of support, and over time, they started to gain a lot of help. Now, the EU, for its part, wanted to help a lot of these organizations grow and wanted to bring stability to Tunisia because they felt that if you improve the rights of migrants in Tunisia, there would be less of them traveling to Europe. You see, when that revolution happened in Libya and there was that civil war, there were a lot of people migrating from North Africa to Europe, some of them illegally and on rickety boats, some of them dying along the way. And there was as well growing opposition to migration in Europe. And thus, the EU wanted to improve the conditions for migrants in these countries so they wouldn't come to Europe. So this policy was known as Fortress Europe. So Europe as well also began to invest in the capacities of North African countries to increase security and prevent migration to Europe. This was known as Fortress Europe, these policies. So as a result, these multicultural coalitions grew in strength, representing migrants, the LGBTQ community, women, religious minorities, sub-Saharan migrants, and the Amazigh. And as their power grew, after the democratic transition after 2014, they began to place pressure on their government to make reforms. And this led as a consequence to the region's first laws against racial discrimination in 2016, which got passed. It also led to the first law in the region to systematically prevent domestic abuse in the home, to prevent domestic abuse against women. It also led as well to this law protecting victims of human trafficking in 2017. Many migrants, one of the ways that they travel across countries and regions into Europe is by relying on human traffickers. But many of these human traffickers often force these migrants into sexual slavery, labor slavery. They get severely abused in the process. And so this law was meant to protect these victims. It was often in the past that if these victims were found, they often themselves would be imprisoned because they were illegal migrants. So the idea with this law was to protect the victims of human trafficking. So these laws were pretty big deals in this country. And so thus we see a lot of improvements in Tunisia during this era. Now, one last thing here. Unfortunately, a couple of years later in 2021, Tunisia's democracy is going to collapse. And all of the other cases in the Arab Spring are not going to have democratic transitions. We will talk about this next time. So I'll see you all later.